Okay, brilliant. Okay, Jazakallah everyone for joining us. Assalamu alaikum. As he said before, my name's Abu Bakr, and today we're joined by Ali, who wrote a really interesting article recently on the philosophy of science and its importance. Ali is a biochemistry and neuroscience graduate, and his interests lie in the subject of religion, philosophy, and sociology, and how all of those intersect. So before we get into it, really, can you just introduce yourself and why you are interested in these areas?
Yeah, sure. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Inshallah, all of you are well and you're having a blessed Friday today. So I kind of started my journey in getting really interested in biology in general, but I got gravitated towards the philosophical sides of things. From a young age, I was really interested in stuff like, well, why does God exist? You know, did he design living organisms and all of that stuff? And I guess throughout my intellectual journey and, you know, as I grew up, I found more and more complexities in the subjects I studied, but also in the philosophical assumptions that what they were grounded in. So that included biochemistry, neurosciences, which I did a master's in, is absolutely filled with philosophical assumptions if you get into it. And then I briefly had a very, very short time teaching as well. And that was really interesting as well, because I did a lot of philosophy there. In our course, we had to do a lot of philosophy of education. And so throughout those years, I've just been sort of, you know, interested in learning philosophy in all different areas, whether that's metaphysics, mind, education. And that's driven me to where I am today.
Perfect. That's very interesting. So in your piece, you started off by basically explaining what philosophy of science is. For those of people who haven't read the article yet, or maybe fully didn't understand, can you just restate what philosophy of science is and what studying that kind of you hope to achieve by studying that kind of area?
Right. So there's a really good way to sort of do this. Let's first think about what philosophy is in general, and then move on from there. So philosophy is basically the study of abstract concepts. It's the study of basically asking the assumptions, asking the network of thoughts about logic. It's about questioning the assumptions, the structures behind why things are the way that they are. Science similarly works on philosophical assumptions. And so the philosophy of science is essentially dealing with, in really simple words, why does science work so well? Why is it that science is so successful? What is it about science that's so successful? And the most important question, what is science? I mean, you bring 10 people and they'll give you 10 different definitions. So philosophy of science is essentially philosophy applied to science, but really looking closely at the philosophical assumptions. So what is it that makes science science? What is it that's a good explanation in science? Why is science different from all the other subjects that we have? So it's really about answering those foundational questions on which the scientific practice is based
on. Amazing, Jazakallah. You start off the article by explaining that philosophy of science is an area or a field of study that's not very studied or given enough importance to. What factors do you think play into that?
So I have a theory about this, and people can debate whether I'm wrong on this or not. But I think after the mechanistic age, so this is, we're talking about an age during, you know, around the Enlightenment. So we've got Descartes, we've got Francis Bacon, and we've got all these people, and they're now really going in with a new epistemology. Now, we're going to get to what epistemology is, but generally speaking, the aim and the way science was recognized changed a lot. People started thinking of things in a lot more mechanistic terms, and they said there was not much point in thinking about the assumptions or other things, even though that there were assumptions there. You know, thinking about nature mechanically more than anything else. And so this was a good thing in the sense that it allowed us to become really specialized in a particular subject. Before a particular time, I can't remember the exact dates, it would make no sense for you to talk about whether philosophy and science was different. It just, the whole question would baffle someone. But because we wanted to really specialize in that empirical realm, and Francis Bacon is partly responsible for this, you know, and Newton himself as well, but it's funny because Newton was a very religious person. We don't tend to highlight that fact. But, you know, it really changed when we took on this mechanistic approach and kind of went away. So the reason we've moved away from that is we sort of tend to think after that, well, philosophy is useless. Or what was the point of thinking about teleology, and what was the point about thinking about all those assumptions, etc.? So as a subject, we kind of don't do philosophy of science, but in reality, everybody does philosophy of science. Everybody does say, you know, this is why my theory is better. This is why I think statistics works. So we do philosophy of science. We just don't pay attention that it could actually be a separate subject.
Yeah. So you kind of said people engage with philosophy of science in, you know, in the everyday without specifically. So let's say for a layman, how would you give like the most basic definition of philosophy of science?
Just what is it that makes science work? Philosophy of science is literally interested in why does science work the way that it does? Why does it work the way that it does? What are the assumptions behind science, and whether science gives us truth or not? So questions like scientism, questions like, well, why is it that my explanation is better? What is it about a scientific explanation that's different from other explanations? Does science really give us access to unobservables? When you say you look at an electron, is that really an electron? Do we really have access, epistemic access to the world the way that we should? Or are our theories just good approximations, or are they not even good approximations? Are they just how we look at the data? So it's about all these assumptions that you kind of take for granted, but you never really ask, well, why is it that that's the case? A really nice way to think about it actually is, I was teaching a physics lesson, and a child came up to one of the teachers next to me, and he went, "Miss, why couldn't an electron be positive? Or why couldn't it be slightly more negative?" And the teacher just went, "We don't ask questions like that." But maybe that's the most important question out there. Why is it the way that it is? So yeah, philosophy of science deals with all sorts of those things.
Yeah, that's very interesting, actually. I'm going to slightly deviate from the questions I have written and just push on from what you said before about the teacher and saying like we don't ask questions like that. Now, it's a very common criticism of religion where like people are like, oh, you can't ask questions. It's the same with science, right? Why do you think people are reluctant to question the basis behind science? And why do you think that discussion doesn't really happen, especially within the Western world?
I think they do happen. I think they just don't happen to be broad enough to actually think about what another person's perspective might be. I mean, you go on Phil papers and you look on their surveys. I mean, the overwhelming number of philosophers are atheists. And then the overwhelming number of scientists these days, they lean towards some kind of naturalism, not even atheism, naturalism, which is a lot stronger position than atheism. And I think the problem here is that it's a cultural dogma. It's just the way the culture is working. It's not that, you know, theism is any weaker than naturalism. In fact, I think naturalism, as Jason Wallace says, is actually quite a weak position. It's not very difficult to go and say, you find one unnatural thing and that's it, game over, naturalism's gone. But I think the real question is, there is a dogma to not look at alternative explanations and to assume, yeah, it's working. I mean, it's working so far. And science is highly successful. And so people think that there's a conflict. And again, some things are really manufactured. I mean, the whole science versus religion conflict is completely manufactured. But it exists. I mean, people still think people didn't know that the world was round, which is complete nonsense. So it's a bit of cultural dogmatism. And this has a lot to do with the history. I point people to one really great author for this, whose name I've completely forgotten, Ronald Numbers. He's got a really great book, Galileo Goes to Jail, and his other book, Newton's Apple. You dig into the history of this stuff, you realize there's a bit of cultural dogmatism here that's going on.
Yeah, with regard to history, like we cannot separate the historical and sentimental relationship that people have with science due to the dark ages that Europe went to, and the kind of pushing out of science that occurred during that era. But in your article, you mentioned that one can pursue God and understand him through reason and science. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Could you repeat that? You can't understand God through?
No. So, sorry, my mistake. You mentioned that one can pursue God and understand Allah through reason and science. Do you just want to expand on that position a bit?
Yeah, I'm not sure what I've... Okay, so essentially, science tells you data about how the world is. Science doesn't tell you how to reason. I think this is really important. What science does, science is a collection of facts. You have to do the job of making sense of those facts. But there's questions about those facts that those facts can't answer themselves. So let me give you an example. Why is there anything rather than nothing? Why does the universe behave in a law-like way? I mean, why is it that today there's gravity and tomorrow morning we don't just start flying upward, right? There's got to be a reason for that. Granted, some philosophers will say there's no reason for that. I think that's very, very strong position to take. And again, I think that's a dogma as well. But I think you can reach God through reason and through science, but people need to really take this with a pinch of salt when I say this. I don't mean you can use science to prove God. You can use science to look at the way the world is structured and look at the organization and the beauty, because I think aesthetic experience is something that totally gets ignored. The only person I've actually seen do an argument for God's existence via beauty is Alexander Pruss, but it's a very complicated argument as of now. But my point being is, let's say you take a cosmological argument. You take facts about the world, you ask about facts about the world, and you notice that things are contingent. They can be, or they don't really have to be. And then you make assumptions about whether God can, whether God can or cannot exist. So that's what I mean when I say, you can use science. I'm very wary on using design arguments. They're not bad arguments. They're good arguments, but they're not the strongest arguments. I usually stay away from them, which is why I always tell people, don't use science to prove God, but use the fact of science and all its amazingness to say, yeah, probably somebody made this.
Yeah. So, like you just said there, right? Really, you explain that the laws of nature and is governed by God. Do you want to elaborate on how society understand these concepts and how separating the philosophy of science from our understanding of science in relation to faith?
Right,
so,
okay, that's quite a big question. Okay, let's break it down. Let's talk about laws of nature and how our ideas have changed. During Aristotelian times, so these are the scholastics. This is before the scientific revolution. Bacon, Descartes, and all these guys come along. Before that, there used to be a sense of, okay, things have teleology in them, which means things are moving towards a particular direction, and that was the kind of physics/metaphysics that we were using. Laws of nature weren't really a thing because most people believed in things having internal capacities, and God endowed them with those internal capacities. So the reason a ball wants to go down is because it has the tendency to want to go and move down. And we have this perfect, elaborate system. A lot of scientists realized, especially Boyle, and there's one other name that's fallen out of my head, and Newton, and they realized, why do we need to do that? Why do things need to have internal capacities? It's a lot easier to just say that there are laws, those laws governed, and they cause things to happen. Now, the interesting part here is these people believed in God. They believed that God decreed the laws of nature, and that then those laws did what they did. As time went on, people realized, well, we don't need teleology. We've got a completely mechanistic philosophy. Let's just assume that the laws of nature, so this law of gravity, this law of, take anything else that you want to take, quantum mechanics or whatever, these are necessary things, and this is the way the world works. And I think it was Stephen Hawking who said, if we have a law of gravity, then we don't need God or something like that. Which really begs two questions. Why is there a law in the first place? What is a law of nature? Because you're just coming out and assuming that the laws of nature are a necessary thing that imposes necessity on things, and that if they're broken, so you see a lot of atheists that come along and say, well, that would break the laws of nature. That really depends on what you mean by law of nature. Because if I say all the laws of nature are, it's just God consistently creating every event, I don't see a violation there. That's just God changing his habit, or God changing his decree or his possibilities. Jeffrey Kopersky has a really, really great book on this, if anybody's interested. But I hope that answered part of your question. What was the other part? I forgot now.
Yeah, that's why I thought I wrote that a bit strange, because it was kind of two questions. You kind of answered it within the question, but how does our understanding of the philosophy of science impact our faith and how we as Muslims view science?
This is a really good question. This is a really, really good question. Science sometimes is presented as an truth-encompassing tool. You know science, you know everything. Philosophy of science gives you a bit of leeway to say, okay, stop. What is it? What is science? Why does it work the way that it does? What kind of assumptions does it make? I don't see any philosophy of science that says God is bad or God should be exclusionary. I mean, okay, yeah, the logical empiricists tried really, really hard, and this was a movement, 20th century, tried really, really hard to get rid of metaphysics, really, really hard. So questions like, they literally went to the extent that they said, well, questions like God are meaningless. They didn't realize that it would apply to their own question. It's really hard to get away from metaphysics. Like, it's really, really hard. But what philosophy of science does, it gives us leeway to understand that science doesn't have to be, the metaphysics of science at least, I think, doesn't need to be interpreted in a completely naturalistic way. I can perfectly do science if I believe God acts consistently in the world and creates the laws of nature. You and me won't have any difference in our empirical findings. And it's sort of teasing that out of people and explaining to them that, look, nobody here is interfering with the actual empirical findings. But the metaphysics that you have, we can have different interpretations about them. And there's really, really interesting debates that you can have in philosophy of science as well. And they bleed into other subjects as well. So, for example, we're talking about the laws of nature. People say, well, you can't have miracles if you have laws of nature. We can come back and say, well, what is a law of nature? You first need to explain that. You need to explain what the limits of science are. Realism versus anti-realism. Are our best scientific theories even approximate truths to what's out there? Maybe, maybe not. You got to do a bit of philosophy of science to find out, right? And then there's questions like randomness. This is my favorite one. Oh, but we have randomness in the world, like random mutations. Why do we need God when we have randomness? But there's a difference between randomness, as in my lack of knowledge, that things are random. I mean, it's perfectly possible for me to determine where a die is going to land if I knew a ridiculous amount of information about how the world is. But is there ontological randomness where you can't predict at all what's going to happen? If God creates every single moment again, then ontological randomness doesn't exist. But if you assume naturalism, then it does. And again, this would not affect the empirical findings whatsoever. It's just we have different metaphysics going on.
Yeah, so just to clarify for people who maybe don't understand, you mentioned epistemology and ontology, which are slightly separate things. Do you want to just explain quickly what both of them are and why we need to understand them in relation to the philosophy of science?
Right, great question. Okay, let's do it this way. You've got metaphysics, first of all. So what is metaphysics? Literal meaning above physics, right? We do metaphysics when there are things that are rationally above just doing the empirical stuff. So they are beyond any rational, not rational, empirical confirmation. So you could do as many experiments as you want, but you won't ever know, for example, what is a cause, what is the nature of a cause, what is the nature of reasoning, for example. How you reason or why your reasoning is justified isn't an empirical question, it's a rational question. So all these questions that can't be further deduced via empiricism or empirical means, they come into metaphysics, okay? So questions you can't answer further just by doing these kind of experiments, they require rational thought. In metaphysics, you've got two big branches. One's called ontology, which is what's out there in the universe. No, not in the universe. What's out there, period. What is reality itself, right? Is reality just nature, right? If you try to answer that question scientifically, you'd be begging the question because you'd be going around in a circle. You'd be using science to confirm science, and that's just begging the question. So you'd have to rationally think about, okay, is science all that's out there, or is there something more? So that's ontology, okay? What is actually out there? Then you've got epistemology. Epistemology is, how do I acquire knowledge? Is the only knowledge that I can acquire knowledge of things that I can see? But isn't my sense perception limited? Does that mean I will only have a particular amount of knowledge? Is the only knowledge that I can gain through sense experience, or are there rational pieces of knowledge that I can discover? Mathematics, for example, logic. So epistemology is more about, how do we come to know the things that we know? How much can we know? So what are the limits of what we can know? Those are the two big differences. So brief summary: ontology, what's out there; epistemology, what can I even know? Those are the two basic definitions you can get.
Okay, yeah. Before I move on to the next section of which deals with a bit more contemporary issues, I'm just going to go through the comments. If anyone has questions now, just feel free to drop them in. One question is asking who I am. My name is Abu Bakr. I am an intern at Traversing Traditions, and yeah, I'm a writer. And for yourself, is there any kind of books that you would recommend to anyone interested in learning more about the philosophy of science?
Yeah, there's a few. Theory and Reality by Peter Godfrey Smith is a very, very good introduction to philosophy of science. I think it really covers every detail. If you're looking for a bit, Kane B has a channel on YouTube, and his Philosophy of Science series is really, really good. And if you want to sort of sail out to the deeper waters, I really like The Physics of Theism by Jeffrey Kaspersky. I think that was a really good book, but it's really, really hard. I will caveat that it's really, really hard for someone who doesn't have a physics background. But philosophy of science is really, really big, so it depends on what you mean. Do you mean introductions, or do you mean something specific? Then that's really a question.
Yeah, I'm going to presume this person meant introductions, mainly because I do not know. Yeah.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to expand on that.
Yeah, Theory and Reality is a really good introduction. I really liked it.
Okay, that's perfect. Okay, there doesn't seem to be any more questions coming in, so I'll just go on to the more this is a bit more temporary. Well, I'll get to the more temporary issues in a second. But the science, by its very nature, by its very laws, is unreliable because obviously with more observations, science has to always be open to change, making it unreliable. But at the same time, it's also the best way for us as humans to understand the natural world or understand things that are going on around us. So how do we, not only as just people, but as Muslims, have to understand these two kind of simultaneous truths?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Again, science is highly successful in what it does. That doesn't mean it's infallible. In fact, even most of our modal beliefs, so beliefs about what is possible, are mostly so they're fallible. You know, nothing in life is absolutely certain apart from a very few set things that you can determine. For example, 2 + 2 = 4. That's just a necessary truth. When it comes to the empirical world, things are always falsifiable, and this really comes into the question of scientific realism. So scientific realism is the debate that are our best scientific theories about unobservables, so things we can't see, true or even approximately true? Most people say, yeah, you know, quantum mechanics is probably true. I can see a bacteria through a microscope, it's probably true. But then, so was pretty much Aristotelian physics back in the day. So was Newtonian mechanics. People pretty much thought, yeah, we've hit the nail. I mean, what can happen? Euclidean geometry, and then suddenly general relativity comes flying in, quantum mechanics comes flying in, and some of the things you thought were absolutely certain go out the window, right? So how do we square that? I don't think there's much of an issue, especially from a Muslim perspective. I'll tell you why. In my and I'm not the best sort of person in Muslim intellectual history, but as far as I understand, theists have always, in general, been capable of handling that change. I mean, in general, metaphysics doesn't change in the sense that these are still contingent objects. God still actualized them. God is the only necessary being. It doesn't really make much of a difference to us. What does need to happen is scholarship needs to keep up, as in Muslim scholarship and Muslim philosophers just need to keep up with new developments. So, for example, a lot of the things in quantum mechanics are really answerable. You know, I mean, I just told you that, you know, you've got something like, you've got a God that actualizes every event, and what's the issue? I mean, why would quantum mechanics be an issue? We were talking about randomness, for example. Well, is there true randomness? Again, we can go out and answer that question. You know, we had a really famous guy that just passed away, John Polkinghorne, who was a major figure in science and philosophy. So we don't need to be scared about the fact that these things change. It's fine. You know, it's highly successful, but we're always open to the fact that these things are going to change. And to a Muslim, it makes no difference whatsoever because our metaphysical worldview is still contained and is very, very able to sort of adapt to these changes, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. So this is a more contemporary issue that I'm going to get onto, and it's linked to what you said last time. In it's about the because of the history of Europe and the relationship with science. Science now holds like very much a big amount of authority over the populace, and therefore people are really scared to ask questions of science. And sometimes people asking questions of science can be dangerous. The example being currently with vaccines. People are very scared of those who question science, because obviously questioning science sometimes can lead to dangerous outcomes, like people dying basically. But you've obviously said already that there is cause and there is reason for us to study these fields and ask questions of science as it is. So where do we draw that line? Like, when do we ask questions, and when do we fall back and say, look, science seems to have the answer here?
I think there's no clear-cut answer to that, because it's a real case-by-case basis, right? Where you notice that there's dubious assumptions being made, go out and question them. There is nothing wrong with doing so. But when you know that the science seems to be really solid on this issue, and there's no reason to consider otherwise, not saying that there wouldn't be a reason to consider it otherwise, there might be later in the future, you should probably take it. I take that with a pinch of salt, because this is very much a case-to-case basis. You can't do this for all of science overall. When our best theories when our best theories are fully explanatory, that's fine. But we recognize that they're fallible. And this is the key point. They are fallible. Somebody could come along with an empirical piece of work and say, this is all going out the window, right? I know one area of contemporary sort of controversy, and this gets a lot of controversy, probably philosophy of psychiatry, where there's this big debate between medical models and people making all sorts of different assumptions. Does it work? Does it not work? And this is one for philosophy of psychiatrists to work out, which itself is a branch of philosophy of science, and only an expert can tell you. But people question those things, and it's okay to. But I would say, let the expert do it. I see a lot of people with this vaccine thing jumping along, going, well, vaccines are awful, vaccines are bad, blah blah blah. Unless you can actually look at the data, unless you've done like tons of modeling, how trials are run. Don't make assumptions there. Like, you need to have a level of caliber and expertise. I don't have that. Like, I couldn't tell you. This is philosophy of medicine, by the way. It's a really, really great book called by Jacob Stegenja. It's called Medical Nihilism. He has literally turned the medical community upside down, and he's a very good lecturer, where he's argued that the effectiveness of modern medicines isn't that great, and he's got a ton of evidence to back that up. Now, if you're on his caliber and you've noticed that about vaccines, you go ahead. But if you haven't been trained in the scientific method, if you haven't been trained in understanding how to evaluate data at the level that these people can, you probably shouldn't get involved. That's my take on it.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm just going to play devil's advocate for the sake of argument and say, people, they do have to, ultimately the vaccine is going to go into their own body, and they would argue that they have the right to question something that is going to happen to them. So if someone is to look at the data, apart from saying like there is no point in doing it, is there any kind of way that a normal person, someone without a highly educated background, could understand these issues, or is it just safe to defer to the experts on these?
Yeah, I would probably go on the expert side, because vaccine trials, vaccine data isn't as simple as it looks. Honestly, it's not as simple as it looks. It never has been. You could get Muslim academics to talk about it. I mean, Al-Balagh Academy, I mean, they did a really great job. They had a press release, etc., about vaccines. I mean, these are people who really know their stuff, right? And I would actually love to see more Muslim academics in medicine come out and talk about these things. I would probably leave it to the expert, because I have a background in biochemistry and neuroscience. I probably couldn't tell you. So I would really, really back off unless you really understand.
The data, yeah, 100%. Like with everything else in life, can only question things once you have the knowledge. Just questioning for the sake of it probably is not going to be
Yeah.
good for you. This is my last question from me. So if anyone else does have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the comments. So it was a question from before, but I thought I'd skip it and leave it to the end. And it's about the relationship that Muslims have with science and the relationship that the West has with science. I'm talking about contemporary and historically. Like, what would you say the differences are? Now, I know that's a massive question, but how do you think the interactions with these different groups is with science, and how they kind of relate to them and understand them?
Sorry, you cut out there for the last. So I think your question was, how do you sort of rationalize our worldview with their worldview and how they're different,
Yes.
especially in past times? I mean, the answer to that is quite interesting because, again, it depends on your metaphysical worldview. I mean, for a Muslim, things are ordered the way that they are because God decided to do so. And so when you discover something, when you find out something, you are seeing a manifestation of God's power and divine will. And so that's what they did, and that's what they were looking for. There was a sense of drive and underpinning of finding beauty in the world for the sake of discovering, more about God more than anything else. One of the things that really bothers me about today's Muslim scientists, and I've got friends and I speak to them, etc. So we've got people who are doing PhDs. They're like, oh, I want to discover this and I want to find out about that and I want to do this and, I want to make a difference. Make a difference for who? I mean, like you could be a PhD, get a Nobel Prize and still go to hell. And I'm pretty sure there are scientists like that who have said disgusting things about God, right? They're probably in the hellfire. Allah knows best, right? They were successful scientists. Why would they go to hell? The reason being is because their science was based on a kind of polytheism, that this is all the world is, that's it, bye-bye. Muslims, on the other hand, this is a manifestation of God's power, this is God's wisdom. Even when people see a bird chirping outside, right, making sounds, they just listen to it and think, wow, God did that for that reason. How magnificent and awesome must that being be? And so you're discovering more about the mind of God. I use that term very carefully. I don't want anybody to sort of jump at me and go, God has a mind, blah, blah, blah. But you're discovering more about God. And I think it's really, and I mention this so much, it's really important to understand that our aesthetic experiences are so much different from that of the naturalist. We see purpose where most people wouldn't. Why does God make the world the way it is? What is the purpose behind this? This is divine manifestation and power. That's what they were doing, right? They were literally trying to find out more about God because they recognized that the world is contingent and the only thing that's actualizing every moment, everything in it is God. So every second I am discovering the will of God, right? So it's kind of like you love someone, you want to find out what are you doing? I want to find out what you're up to, right? I want to find out more about you. That's how a Muslim looks at it. Whereas a naturalist kind of sits there and goes, not that they're boring, I mean, they just go sit there, wow, the stars. Whereas a person says, wow, Allah made those stars. That's the difference in really layman's terms.
Yeah, 100%. Like Allah tells us in the Quran many times, just observe, look around you, and through just observation, the logical conclusion is that there is a God out there. So this is a question. Wait, can you hear me still?
I can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, I thought I cut out there. From someone. Ali seems to tweet more about fine-tuning concept these days. So the question here is, how do you relate these fine-tuning arguments ontology?
Fine-tuning arguments to ontology. I didn't think they would make any claims of, okay. Right, okay, this is an interesting one because I don't know what you're saying. Fine-tuning itself could tell you, okay, yeah, okay. It can, depending on what the solution is to the fine-tuning problem, yes. yes, it will tell you something about ontology. The reason I'm tweeting so much about this is because I'm obsessed with Jason Waller's book, Cosmological Fine-Tuning Arguments, and I'm super excited because I get to have a Zoom call with him and talk to him about his book and all the questions I have. So if you do a fine-tuning argument, you've got three real options here, okay? Four, maybe. The first option, it's a brute fact, just the way that it is. No other reason whatsoever for why. So then your ontology is, all we have is the universe, that's it. The second option is if you go for a multiverse. Multiverses are really interesting because for multiverses to do the job of explaining fine-tuning, you got to have an infinite multiverse. You can't just have a finite multiverse. So if you had like an eternal expansion multiverse, which is around 10 to the power of 500, it still wouldn't explain fine-tuning. You still got the fine-tuning problem, and you possibly have another fine-tuning problem to explain why you had that kind of eternal expansion in the first place. So multiverses will only do the job if you have a super kind of multiverse, which Max Tegmark, I believe, argues for. I think Smolin does, not sure. But one other person does, where you have an infinite number of every kind of universe that there is out there, and then an infinite number of those infinite number of universes, which is just insane, okay? That would do the job. And then the third option is theism, so God. There'd be a stalemate, as Jason Waller says, there'll be a stalemate between that kind of multiverse and God. But if you take it to the level of possible worlds, then you could make a theistic argument, but I'm not sure whether it succeeds or not. Again, we're going way out of topic now because this is fine-tuning and that's very different. There's philosophy of science in fine-tuning. So for example, there's questions about probability. There's major questions about the theory of probability, about what constitutes an explanation, what constitutes design. These are all big questions that you could ask, that philosophy of science is related to these. And questions, some really interesting questions that are not philosophy of science, but metaphysics in general. So for example, one of the things that people come up and say, is, I find this really fascinating, is modality. So modalities are possibility and necessity. So it's possible that behind me right now, there was like a dinosaur. It's possible because I can conceive of the situation. Some people would deny possibility altogether. They would say, you know, you can't. But if you do that, then a lot of science goes out the window because science is based on the fact that I can conceive of things that may have possibilities, but they're fallible. Not that just because I conceive of something that's possible, it's going to happen. So that's also a really interesting debate about possibility, because some people are just like, yeah, you're imagining angels and stuff like that, blah, blah, blah. But it's kind of funny because if you deny that, and if you deny can conceivability, conceiving meaning a mental act, entail possibility, and you deny that for angels, etc., you're going to have a lot of trouble with science in general because you make that presumption when you do science. You make that presumption. Nobody's ever seen a dinosaur directly. You first conceive of it, you conceive of arguments before you go into the lab, and then you go into the lab and do your experiments and test. Imagine we didn't have that capacity. That was a big sidetrack, but I really wanted to make you appreciate that point because I see ex-Muslims going like, you're so dumb, angels, blah, blah. But no, I mean, unless you want to radically alter your modal beliefs, I think it's okay. So yeah.
That's a very interesting point. I've never actually really thought of that. I always just go back to the fact that, you know, if the God exists, then, you know, it's not a question whether there could be angels that we couldn't see or not. But yeah, I never really thought of it as questioning the foundations of the philosophies of that like underpin science. One last question here, and it's slightly away from what you were saying, but it's worth maybe asking. Is there only two forms of philosophy, one that acknowledges creator and one that doesn't?
No. And this is the thing. So one of the best, so we'll actually do a bit of philosophy of science here. One of the really interesting philosophical arguments or debates is what is science and what isn't science? And the actual answer is nobody's ever solved that problem. I've never seen it being solved. Similarly, what is philosophy and what is science is pretty much still out there. And so what I'm saying is it's really hard to make these big distinction. Oh, is there a philosophy with God and is there a philosophy without God? Well, there'll be general philosophy and there'll be certain topics that bleed into both. We just talked about modality, for example, general metaphysics. It's going to go both ways. You know, I think philosophy is just one big subject. And to say, oh, is there one philosophy for atheists and one philosophy for theists? Yeah, there's ideas out there, but this idea that there can be a completely different philosophy. Philosophy is essentially a toolkit. It's a toolkit, and this is, I've changed my understanding of philosophy significantly. I've gone away from just reading arguments and trying to master them to, how do I get these tools? How do I get to use those tools in different places? So you should really think of philosophy as a tool like maths, but just using logic and mental exercises more than anything else.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. It looks like there's no other questions, so I'll give you an opportunity to kind of, give your concluding thoughts and a message that you want to give to people listening, inshallah.
Right, so I think, mashallah, the Muslim community is amazing. It's the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, no doubt about it. It would be amazing. You don't need to be scared of science. Don't let anyone ever bully you into saying, oh, faith and science? No, we're very proud of our creator. And we need to stop thinking of the world. One of the things I think philosophy of science really helps you do, it helps you understand the fact that there are philosophical assumptions, and if there are philosophical assumptions to things, that there's a rational aspect to them. And since God is a rational being, you can sort of connect those two things together. People think, people don't think philosophically, they think that empiricism is just one thing, the empirical world and God, and they're so different from each other. But when you realize that there's a rational basis to things, and God himself is a metaphysical being, you kind of start to see, oh, wait, maybe God did it this way, and maybe God did things this way. We need to stop thinking of science as one thing and religion as this other thing, and there's two different worlds. Remember, God's creating every moment. It's God's world, which means that this science is God's science. It's God doing what he wants to do. We need to get back into that frame. We need to start looking at every single one of these things as manifestations of God's power and wisdom. That is only going to happen when we start accepting that this whole secularism thing, this whole science and naturalism is a default, is true. It's not default true. It's perfectly consistent with theism as well. There's some great work that's out there. So don't be afraid of science. Question the assumptions, know that it's valuable, and know that there's many, many different ways to interpret what's going on in the world. And you can be just as good a scientist and believe in God just as much. No one should be able to stop you from doing that. That's all.
Yeah, perfect. Jazakallah khair. Allah reward you for enlightening us all today. I certainly have learned a lot. It's an area that I've been interested in, but because I'm not a scientist, I find really, really hard to understand. But alhamdulillah, you kind of, simplified it for myself, and hopefully for those people listening, in a way that we can all at least grasp what the basics are. So inshallah, this is the first of a few bi-weekly talks with our other. We will be having with other writers, inshallah, and they will continue. So we pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this talk that we've had is beneficial to everyone, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts barakah in it, and puts blessings in it, and he gives us the ability to seek the truth, not only through Islam, but through science as well. And through science that we can see the magnificence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ameen. Okay, Jazakallah khair for joining us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam, bro. Take care, guys.